Other factors, too, contributed to the increasing dissatisfaction of the Indians. The Spanish demands also took away from the Pueblo food that they had previously traded with nomadic Indians, people that we've come to call the Apache, Navajo, and Ute.
These nomadic peoples who specialized in hunting and gathering needed to get some corn from the Pueblo. But when the Spanish were taking all of the surplus, the Pueblo had nothing to trade. The nomads regarded this as a betrayal, and so they began to attack the Pueblo. So the Pueblo are suffering on every front. They're suffering from drought, they're suffering from disease, they're suffering from raids by the nomads. The conclusion they reach is that these Spanish missionaries are not providing the spiritual or the worldly protection that the Pueblo had expected. And this dissatisfaction then works to the advantage of those Indian leaders, those spiritual leaders known as the shaman.
One leading shaman was a man named Pope. He brought the Pueblo people together against the Spanish colonists and led the revolt of 1680, which drove the Spanish out.
He was arrested and charged with sorcery and brutally whipped and nearly executed. But the Spanish ended up releasing him because the other Pueblo put such pressure on them not to execute Pope and the other shaman. But a few years later, in 1680, Pope managed to unite most of the Pueblo people in a revolt meant to totally destroy the Spanish occupation of New Mexico and to kick them out. And they killed dozens of Spaniards in this uprising, and the Spanish survivors were forced to flee from Santa Fe and their other settlements and head south to El Paso, where they found refuge.
About 10 years later, in 1691, Diego de Vargas, a resourceful Spanish nobleman, led the Spanish colonists back to Santa Fe and reclaimed the city. From then on, an uneasy peace existed between the Spaniards and the Pueblo Indians.
In the wake of that, when the Spanish did come in during the 1690s and restore their rule, they had to govern with a little more pragmatism, and they had to understand that the Indians would keep secrets and would keep their kivas and their katsinas, as long as those Indians would also take Mass and accept Catholic instruction. That was a compromise the missionaries could accept in the 1690s and thereafter. But it was a lesson they had to learn the hard way after a violent rebellion.
In the final analysis, we can think of the Spanish settlement of the American Southwest not as a failure, but as a success in their prime purpose, creating a buffer zone to protect the core of their American empire, Mexico.
So the Spanish colonies in New Mexico and Texas and Florida and California we can perceive as remarkable successes given their lack of resources and what they were up against. They consolidated a frontier for a very long period of time that kept these rival empires away from what was most important to the Spanish, Mexico.
From the late 18th century forward, areas under Spanish control began to decrease as a result of pressure from the new United States that had begun to explore, colonize, and expand west beyond the Appalachian Mountains. Eventually, the Spanish-American War in 1898 ended Spain's dominion over all her holdings in North America, including the West Indian islands of Cuba and Puerto Rico.